Gil, first of all, thank you for taking your time. Really appreciate it. Um,
Sure.
I've been looking at your work for the last few months, on and off a bit, and it's super fascinating. Especially like I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, but is it Shimon or Shimon?
Yeah, you got it.
Shimon, yeah,
Simon, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it's so cool, man. Like, and I don't have an intelligent question for it. The only question that comes to mind is like, how the hell does it work? That's the only thing I can think about.
Yeah. And a similar question is how the hell did you come up with the idea and why?
Yeah.
Which I'll also be happy to answer. Uh, so it works is actually a more complicated way to explain because it works in so many ways. It is about 15 years old from conception, maybe about 10, 11 years old since we started perform with it. So over this time, I had students coming to Georgia Tech Center for Music Technology, where I teach and when I direct the center. And they came in and out, and each one of them came up with a different idea, and we helped them coming up with other ideas. So Shimon can improvise jazz, Shimon can play marimba, play drum, Shimon can sing, Shimon can dance. So each one of these modules work differently, and I'll be happy to get into it. But maybe I'll answer my own question first, which is why musical robots, which is for many years I played with humans, and humans are awesome. I love to play with humans. I was always inspired by playing with humans, but there was a low period in my creativity where I kind of didn't have any new ideas, and I said maybe computers can generate music that will surprise me, that will inspire me. So originally I just developed algorithms that would listen to me playing piano, try to analyze it, and then respond to me in a very algorithmic way. And I thought maybe something will pick up that will be interesting that I never heard before from humans because computers work differently than humans. And when this kind of worked out, I was starting to miss the whole idea of acoustic sound and visual cues and stage presence. But I still wanted the digital brain. I still wanted something that would be unique in the way it plays back at me and surprise me. And the answer was robots, obviously, because they have the digital brains that can use algorithms. Be happy to tell more about these algorithms. But they also have the mechanical body to be able to play in physical and acoustic way, the richness of acoustic sound, the visual cues that are physics-based, and so on. So the first robot was actually only a drummer. He was named, still is, he's in my office, called Hailey, played a power drum, listens to how humans play the drum with very directed microphones, and then improvise back. And Shimon was the next step, which is uh, harmonic and melodic. So not only drums, not only percussion sounds, but also a full scale. So we can start to think about theory and harmony and melody. But it also had a head, a social head, as opposed to Hailey that just plays with its arms. And the heads are very important because they provide social cues. They let you know when to start, where to end. When it detects a beat, it can bob its head and immediately you groove with it much more. If it sounds, if it listens to something that interests him, he can look at you. He can even frown when he doesn't like what you like, or kind of have a very happy kind of gesture when he does. All of the things that you get from human in terms of social, but again, having the algorithms that are unique and different.
But but still, like for me, with my knowledge, because I have zero knowledge in machine learning algorithms. So to me, it's almost like magic. Like you have this robot here, and we talk about it like it's a human. Like it's almost like it's reacting to you. It has a, it does the head movements, and it obviously hears what you're playing and reacts to that. So how the hell does that work? I mean, where do you start in that process? Yeah, I'd love to hear about that. Like, where do you start solving a problem like that? Because I guess it is a problem, right?
Yes, yes. So the first step is to think about how Shimon would listen and understand what I'm playing. And the simplest way, and I'm not sure how familiar your listeners are with protocols, but I'm sure many musicians are familiar with MIDI. So the basic way was using a protocol of MIDI, which basically I play keyboard, and every note that I play and how loud I play it and how many notes, everything is automatically, very accurately sent to the brain of Shimon, which originally was a computer that is connected to Shimon. Later, we actually embedded some of the GPUs that does machine learning inside a robot, such as Shimi. But originally, it was like a computer at the side that connects to Shimon to operate the arms. So now we have to embed some algorithms that understand what it plays. So it can get the notes, but does it know if it's a major or a minor? Does it know if it's a dissonance, if it's a triton interval, or is it consonance? Maybe it's a fifth. So there's a bunch of algorithms that are based on music theory that can understand what I'm playing. So that's about the listening. And we try to have Shimon listen like a human. So he can understand what is a beat. If I play in a particular beat, it does beat detection and understand this is a 1 and this is maybe 60 BPM. There are algorithms in the field of music information retrieval that can do that, that looked at a musical signal, MIDI or audio, and can give you some musical information about what's going on there, like higher level musical information, not only what the note is, but what is a key, what is a scale, what's a transposition here, whether if you play with audio, because Shimon can also listen not only to MIDI, it can listen also to a saxophone player. So we analyze the audio, and then we can analyze how harsh the sound is. Is it beautiful, sinusoidal, or does it have a lot of when a saxophone player is playing? And that's basically how humans listen to music. They try to see what are the musical elements and some high-level aspects, such as tension and release and consonance and dissonance and stuff like that. And then the question is, how does it respond? So understanding, listen like a human is one thing, but then we have the whole responding, which here my slogan is play like a machine. So Shimon is designed to listen like a human, but play like a machine. So we talked about the listen like a human, but as to play like a machine is when we don't want it to play like a human, because humans are awesome in playing like a human. We want it to use this information, but play something a little different. Use algorithms that humans don't use to play back at me. So some ideas would be, for example, if it detects a particular chord progression, he knows that I'm going from C major to F minor, and then I'm going to G, and then to C. It knows I just played 1, 4, 5, 1 with 4 in minor. And then it can start to use algorithm for improvisation. It can improvise based on rules of jazz, but it can also improvise in other rules, in modified rules that will be a little off key, a little off charter, and that's where it's interesting for me to see what it is doing based on my chord progression. Or if I give it a particular melody, it can use algorithms such as, let's say, cellular automata or genetic algorithms, where many generations of modifications of musical genes are being randomly created and selected for some kind of a fitness function, and then play back something at me that would be only something that a robot would play, because humans don't use genetic algorithms when they think about music. And the idea is that I will pick up on what it plays back to me. And of course, the playing back is sending all of this symbolic data based on this algorithm to the arms, so it can play the melody, and to the head, so it can show me that it knows what the beat is and what's the tempo and so on. And the promise is that if it's really kind of connected to me, because it understands music like me, but it's a little off, not completely off. If it's completely off and random, it's not interesting. You have to feel the connection that is somehow similar to what I built, but also different for me to build on it in a different way than what I would build when I play with a human.
Super interesting. But so you talk about like algorithms and stuff. So is that so? I mean, how does that all work together? Is it something you feed something to this algorithm, so to speak, and whatever happens, or is it all written? Is it all like based on rules you define, or is it just let's feed whatever? Like the sound of a trumpet, and then you just see what happens? Is it at that level, or is it way more structured?
I can give you an example. As I mentioned, there are so many examples. The robot has been around for 11, 12 years as a working robot, and many ideas have been explored. I'll give you one just to give you a more specific understanding of one way that we can go about it. Let's talk about genetic algorithms. So I feed the robot with a population of motifs. So I'm a piano player. I played a bunch of motifs. This is my style. And it just gets we call it in genetic algorithm population. Many, I think it was like 200 different motifs, and it's all in MIDI. And then when I play something during the performance, I play piano. It looks at its population of motifs, and then it runs genetic algorithm. It tries to find the ones that are most similar to what I played. And nothing is completely similar because you know there are so many combination of notes that you can play, and then it chooses the top 50%, and then out of them it generates another 50 and finds the top 50, and at some point it plays something back at me that because it looked for something similar in what I played from its population, but it also had all kind of random mutations into this population and all kind of crossbreed between motifs. Whatever it plays back will be similar to what I play, but not completely not the same, because I stopped this population and generation after maybe 50 kind of phases. So I will get something that has some random elements, but also something that try to sound like me. So it will sound like me, but a little different. Here, another example. We use what's called Markov Chains. And we feed the robot with improvisations by the great jazz master, let's say Monk and Coltrane. So transposed something like 200, I believe, different improvisations by these masters, and then it runs Markov chains over these improvisations, meaning it looks for statistical likelihood of every note to follow other notes. So it looks at, let's say in Monk, after F sharp, there's 30% that there will be a G. I'm making it up. It's not true, but just an example. And in Coltrane, it's only 20%. And also for Monk, again, I'm making up an idea. After a quarter note, there's 35% that it will play an eighth note, and another 10% that it will play a triplet or something like that. So then it kind of captures the style of these musicians. But what's interesting is when I play something in real time on stage, it can use all of this knowledge to play back to me in statistical, stylistic similarity to these musicians, but it can also do all kind of morphing. It can take some of Monk, some of Coltrane numbers and statistics and morph it together to a style that will be 30% Monk, 30% Coltrane, and maybe another 40% my own style. That will be, again, similar to me because it listens to me and it also analyzes statistics of my playing, but it's also very different because it has some of Monk in it and some of Coltrane in it, and that's awesome for me. I would pay a lot of money to play with them for real, but this is a version of it that can kind of inspire me to play back in a different way. And then again, it listens to me, and there's a lot of back and forth of hopefully mutual inspiration.
Super fascinating. But so you talk about like the genetic algorithms and stuff. What was the process of developing those algorithms and yeah, defining what they should do and stuff like that?
So we usually in my group are not inventing new algorithms. We usually look at state-of-the-art computer science and we borrow algorithms that work in other domains. So genetic algorithm is existing and has been used for many years for optimization problems, and by entering some randomness into the process, but also some kind of a fitness function, just like evolution. So basically, we needed to think about when we do the random, what kind of random elements we introduce to these genes, quote unquote, and what kind of crossbreed between genes we introduce. So for example, let's say I played 100 motifs, and when it looked for the 50 that are most similar, then we start to crossbreed between these two. So we take the beginning of one and the end of the other, or we just introduce mutations that every sharp note becomes a flat note. So there's some musical knowledge in deciding how to do the, we call it stochastic. It's not completely random. It has a random element, but it's also informed by music theory and understanding of music in general. And when something comes back at me, it will have this DNA, but it will also have this random mutation that we algorithmically enter into it, which we hope will be interesting.
Yeah, interesting. But so in the process of, because I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, but that machine learning is also a big part of this. And that's how he eventually, I guess, learns more. So
yeah, the example I gave about Coltrane and Monk use machine learning because it's based on data. We inform the robot with a lot of data, and then it come up with statistical understanding of the data. There is another way to do this kind of interaction, which is rule-based systems. Basically, the whole field can be divided either to database system, when you feed the robot or the network with a lot of data and it tries to find features in the data, or you feed the robot with rules. So, for example, when I said I play C and the robot plays F sharp, these are the rules. You can play this note and you cannot play this note, or you have to have this kind of transition or transposition from C to F. This is the most likely notes to play. We just tell him what to play, and then there's some random elements based on what he plays. But I think go ahead.
No. Sorry, keep going.
So I think the more recent work that we did was more sophisticated machine learning work. Actually, we went into deep learning, which is multiple layers of artificial neuron, in terms of feeding the data into the network and how it can find features in it. And then Shimon, as I mentioned before, can also sing and actually come up with its own lyrics. So what we did is we fed it with thousands of songs, from prog rock to jazz to pop, and we then it finds connection between different words, and it knows that if this word appears, there's likelihood for other words to follow and to come before to make sense. Similar to GPTs that you may know, all kind of language generation algorithms. And what we did there is we fed a theme to this network. So I can give it love and see, based on the themes, what of all the data sets that we trained the network on, what kind of lyrics it will come up with. And then it uses voice synthesis to actually sing it. Sometimes we sing it as a rap, so we have a rap battle, Shimon with a rapper, go back and forth. It constantly listens to the rapper, try to find a few words, keywords from what the rapper is rapping, and then come back with a response, back and forth. And we also used some singing voice. We didn't use our own singing voice. We used it from a university in Barcelona, UPF. And then the sound sounds less like Siri or like computerized sound. It sounds much more human, because they train their synthesizer on human voice. And all of these examples, if you Google Shimon sings, you'll see how he sings. If you Google Shimon raps, you'll see a bunch of rap and battles. And definitely Shimon improvises, you'll find most of our work there.
Yeah, it's super cool, man. But so, maybe this is a stupid question, but when you talk about like feeding Shimon with a data set, whatever is music, whatever, and then it finds, for example, like they find certain words. Like, what does that all mean? Like, does that mean you? And again, maybe it sounds stupid, but does it mean you just plug something into whatever the robot is using, like a computer, and then the algorithm and all that takes over and processes the sound or the lyrics? Is that how it works, or?
So it works similarly. The training is happening offline. because it takes time. We need a very fast GPU to run over all of this data and find this connection, find the embeddings in the network, and come up with a generative way to create new material based on what it was trained. Sometimes it can take days or weeks, depending on how big the data is. And the bigger the data, the more likely you are to get with something meaningful, because it really needs big data. The reason that deep learning became much more effective than previous method is because now we have access to big data, a lot of information, all the lyrics in the world, many improvisations and so on. So, and that's what happens offline. And as I mentioned, depends how much you train it, but it can take hours, days, weeks, and even more. And then in real time, it uses all the training, everything that it learned, all the connections between the different lyrics, or if it's singing, or between the different notes and intervals and rhythms, if it's improvising. Then it does it in real time. Then it listens to what I play and try to find the adequate response.
And those responses are based on, for example, the rules you've set, right? Or can it decide for itself?
Well, in this case, it's based on the data. Yes, there are some rules that we put over the data. For example, trading 4 in jazz. So we tell it, okay, generate something after 4 bars. So I can play 4 and it can play 4 and back and forth and back and forth. So it's even in the database system, we have some rules just to structure the piece. But the example I just described is not based on rules. It's based on data, except the structure. And basically the generation happens automatically. It listens to what I play and tries to respond with something meaningful. We also played with rule-based system, as I mentioned, and when Shimon knows what's the music theory and knows what notes to play over what chords, and then it actually follow some kind of system with likelihood for different notes to play based on these rules.
But so what is it in machine learning that makes the computer learn? Like, what is it, like, how is it saved, for lack of a better word? Because human, obviously we learn something new and we remember it. Is that what happens with a machine too? Like, it gets fed a lot of data and then eventually what it learned is then saved and the whole thing is erased? Or how does that work?
Yeah, the one thing about machine learning, and by the way, I'm not a machine learning expert. I'm a musician foremost, and I work with students who are much more into machine learning. So what I can tell you is, to explain to you machine learning, we need many more podcasts. And I will not explain. I'm not the best person to explain exactly the technicalities of it, but even my knowledge will need much more than what we have right now. But I'll address your particular question about remembering or forgetting. This is one benefit that maybe machine learning has, because it does not forget. Our brain is much more sophisticated and complicated than any neural networks that is currently being used. But our brain also has some limitations and some way that it's organized, such as short-term memory and long-term memory, and things that are being forgotten. And basically, when you train a network, you can just save it, and you can add another hard disk and save some more. And it not necessarily should. The whole idea of forgetting is not so relevant for that. But the learning is still not as deep as even a toddler's brain, which can learn everything. And we are still looking at general intelligence, where a machine learning system can learn anything, whether it's lyrics or just faces or music, and just will be open, just like a infant brain, to learn everything around the world. Currently, most of the work, there's some work that is looking at general intelligence, but most of the work, definitely the work that we are doing, is almost like expert systems that is trained to learn from particular domain. In our case, it's everything that has to do with music.
Right. Makes sense. But so do you remember, like, the first few times when Shimon actually responded to you and you can play with him or her, or it? Do you remember?
Yeah, whatever you like.
Do you remember those moments, like when you found, oh, it's working?
Yeah. beginning, it was much more about forgiving Shimon for making mistakes and kind of cringing at some of the things that you knew or I knew what are the reasons for it to play things that I didn't appreciate, and why doesn't it sound great, and why there isn't amazing motifs that I can really be inspired by. But over the last 10 or more years, there have been more and more moments where I was surprised, I was inspired, and it became better. And the system became deeper and deeper and more sophisticated, up to a point that I don't know exactly why it plays something to me, the way it plays it. It's not as simple for me to understand. And when that happened, it's really great, because when I say, where did that come from? That's where I can get inspired. And there are more and more moments like that over the last recent years.
But is the plan to release, so maybe you already have, but to release like an album of music where it's just you and him, or it, I should say, or is that the plan?
Yeah, actually, we just came up. It was just before the pandemic, so it kind of got lost, and we wanted to actually tour. We came up with an album called Shimon Sings. It's the first time we actually had songs with lyrics. We don't have an album of Shimon improvises, but there are many videos online. But for the album, we have 10 songs. It's on Spotify, it's on everywhere, and you can listen to the lyrics that it comes up with. It was a combination between me coming up with musical ideas, and it kind of organizes them together, and I come up with a melody, and it come up with the lyrics to the melody, and it's out there.
Cool. I'm gonna check it out. What was it called? Shimon Sings. Cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll check it out, and I leave a link
Check
also
it out.
so people can check it out. But so, like working, like in your case, like your background is in music, and then you moved into robots and technology, data, and all that. So it makes me wonder: have you, because both, like you have the artistic side, but you also have the very logical side, I assume. And how do you like cultivate the logical side? Because I'm also coming from a musical background, and now I moved into programming myself. So how do you like try to bring in, or maybe practice? Maybe that's the wrong word, but practice your logical thinking. Is that something you have done, or have you always had that?
Yes, I've always been fascinated by technology and studied computer science. I did double major in undergrad between computer science and music. And I was always looking at the state of the art. And I always tried to borrow from other domains in computer science. For example, I gave you a couple of examples so far: genetic algorithm, Markov chains. Another example is fractals. And I don't know if you are familiar with this kind of visual fractals where you have shapes inside shapes, very recursive. And when I saw algorithms that create these kind of fractals-based visuals, I was inspired, and I was thinking, okay, this is exactly what music is about. It's about patterns, and small patterns inside big patterns. And when you zoom in, you can see more pattern, and then you go out, you can see the big, picture. So one of the efforts that we did for Shimon is to use fractals and see how we can take the same algorithm of fractals in order to create music that has this pattern inside patterns inside patterns. Another example, I don't know if you're familiar with cellular automata. There's one particular one called the Game of Life, when you have a grid of cells, and every cell has a very simple instruction. It can either be alive if there are X cells around it alive, and then it's white, just basic black and white stuff. Or it can be dead if there's less than, let's say, 3 white cells around it, it turns black. So every cell has a very simple rule. It's called the decentralized systems. You just know about yourself. Just look around. How many cells I have white around me, how many cells are black, and I will change black or white accordingly. So it sounds simple, and it sounds that nothing interesting can happen. But if you look at Game of Life online, you will see that depending on how you start, amazing patterns can happen, because if one of them become black, then suddenly the one next to it said, hey, now I have 3 blacks next to me and not 2, so I will turn white, and so on. And when it goes over a grid of like a math paper, you can see structure, all kind of circles form, and suddenly a black cell get into the circle and it completely explode because it's changed the whole big structure there, and snakes come in and out, and some beautiful things. So I immediately think, okay, this is very interesting concept. Let's try it in music. Let's try the equivalent of dead or alive in music. Let's say it plays this particular note if there are these notes around it, and that particular note if there are other notes around it. And then you just start the system and you press play, and there's a bunch of notes coming around you. And oftentimes it will just be messy and cacophonic, but sometimes it's working, it's successful. Suddenly you have a pattern, you have a little melody that repeats itself until a different melody comes and explodes everything, and so forth and so on. So I always think about music and technology together, about what kind of things I can borrow from both worlds to ignite something new, and that will be nothing of any of these worlds, that will hopefully be inspiring.
That's super cool. I've heard about Game of Life. I never checked it out, but that's a super cool concept of that, and trying to bring that to music. Actually, that's very cool. But so how do you? Is that something you have developed, or that's something you just play with around at home? Is it something people can check out too, like your music version of that?
Yes, actually, we are working now with a new system. We have 12 new robots that are standing next to each other in a form of a forest. It's actually called forest. And we have multiple performances with them. We're actually going to release this performance of the forest dancing with dancers. Looking at the dancers and moving to the dancers and listening to musicians and moving according to the sound. But for this forest of 12 different arms, we did try, one of my students, Jeppsson, did try to have a game of life, and the robot basically played different sounds and move differently based on how the robots around it sound and move. And again, the idea is that big patterns emerge from very simple rules, decentralized rules. And we are going to have a concert showing that here at Geotech. We may stream it in December 11th.
Cool. And that's going to be YouTube, or?
If we stream it, we didn't decide yet. Yes, we're going to stream it on YouTube.
I'll be on the lookout for that. That's super cool, man. I really enjoy those sort of things. But so talking about patterns and stuff in music, what are some of the patterns you found when you started looking into patterns, so to speak?
So I think one of the most important patterns in music are about tension and release. And that's why we like music, that's why we listen to music. We want things to become tense and then we want them to get released, because if there aren't this kind of curves, it's much less interesting to listen to music. Even for repetitive music, I don't know, if we talk about EDM even, that's very repetitive. The music would not be the same if you didn't have these drops that will suddenly release all the tension, and we didn't have a build-up. So tension can be melodic, it can be based on dissonance, and consonance based on tonal music, but it can also be based on, in EDM, for example, based on the energy and the density and the volume and the kind of instruments, the timbre of the instruments. So when you have the right kind of spread of tension and release, whatever it is, timbre-based, theory-based, tonal theory-based, that's where I know we have succeeded. If we created a piece that actually let you follow a story or a narrative with these patterns of something will become really tense up to a point that you really wanted to get released, and suddenly you're back home, that's the patterns we try to achieve with our algorithms and robots as well.
Wow, that's very cool. And any other patterns you have found that are equally or less important?
So that's big. I I think what I said about tension release, that's true about every music. Now, in different genres, you have different patterns. For example, you have a pattern of a chord progression. In jazz, for example, that repeats. You just have a standard, and then the pattern will be the same chord progression. And the interesting thing that happens above it is how people improvise and what other musicians are doing. So when we play jazz with Shimon, we also are exploring how to create this kind of some elements that repeat themselves and some elements that are different, and just the right level of repetition and new information to create patterns that evolve.
Right. Interesting. But so I saw that your work with I think his name is Jason Barnes, the drummer. You were involved in that, right? Yeah.
Yes.
And that was that prosthetic robotic arm, and that's also damn, it's super fascinating. Also, man, like what you guys do is super incredible. Um, but does he control that arm with his for lack of a better word, his brain? Like it's like he has a real hand, and then he reads the I don't know what it's called, like the electronic things coming from his arm or something. I know I bushed that explanation completely, but it's
That's good. So yeah, we at some point I moved to work with Jason and actually with a few other amputees that came through our lab, and the idea was to bring some of the creative ideas that we have from the other robots into the body, so it's part of the body, and actually to work and help people who lost some abilities to gain them, and not only to gain them, but actually to exceed what they were able to use. So the first project was an EMG-based prosthetic arm that allowed Jason Barnes to play drums. Later, we had a more sophisticated system that allowed him to play piano. But the first EMG, electromyography, basically has sensors on his forearms that sense the electrical activity in the muscles that he still have in his residual limb. And because your brain is still connected to, if you lose your arm, the connection between the brain and the part of the arm that you didn't lose still exists. And he lost it just below the elbow. So we could sense when he wanted to move his phantom finger, he didn't have a finger, but when he wanted, he can imagine how to move it with his brain. And we can sense how the muscle next to his elbow react. And same with any other finger. And when he closes a fist, we can sense different activity of EMG. When he opens it, we can and we did not invent this as well. This is technologies that you can find in many power prosthetics. If you have ever seen someone wearing prosthetic with a full arm and a full hand, you can see how people go next to an object and can concentrate on squeezing the arm, and they can grab it and they can open it. So it doesn't sense the brain, but it senses the electrical activity from the brain as it appears on the residual limb. But what we did is we tried to take it and see how can he squeeze and open his hand so he can create hits that are bouncy and less bouncy. But because I'm interested in artificial creativity, I also suggested to Jason to have a different stick. So his first arm had 2 sticks, and the second stick has what we called a mind of its own. Second stick did not respond to his muscle, but actually create rhythms based on what we just talked about, listening to other musicians, listening to his own music. So whenever he wants, he can have his own arm surprising and inspiring him by playing new ideas based on what he detects. But when he also wants, he can just decide just to work with a one stick and get a much more expressive, to become much more expressive in how he plays drums. And then we moved to work with him on what we call the Skywalker Hand. And there we used an ultrasound sensor that can sense much more accurately, not only whether he holds, squeezes a stick and opens it, but actually what finger he's going to move, what phantom finger he is planning to move. And we used ultrasound because we saw that when he tries to move his phantom fingers, the muscle in his next to his elbow and his forearm move completely different. But it's a very complicated connection. Sometimes, one muscle can move different fingers in different ways. Sometimes two muscles would have to be moved to control one finger. So we just trained the system. We collected a lot of data from him, and he labeled it. So he moved his thumb and labeled it. Now I'm moving my phantom thumb. That's how it looks like. Now I'm moving the other finger, the pinky, and so on. And we use all of this data to train the system, what muscles move how based on what finger. And then in real time, and now he can move his phantom finger, and we connected a commercial 5-finger arm to him, and we can make the right finger move. And we have a very nice video that we have a couple of videos. First one is the first one he actually was able to play Ode to Joy. He played Ode to Joy, and it was very exciting. And then he practiced, because there's, you need to do it fast, you need to do it to the rhythm, and he now can play piano.
Wow. That's incredible, man. Really, really incredible. It's really fascinating to hear. But so, yeah, I was just trying to think about a follow-up question because I just immersed in your story. But when you work on a problem like that, I mean, what's the? You told the journey now, but I guess there's so much to it that I don't even know where to begin. I like a problem like that, but so it's the first thing to make him come in to map, like you said, like now I'm doing the thumb, for example. You map it, etc., etc. Is that how you start a project like that, and then it keeps evolving, and eventually he has his hand and he can just rock out again?
Yeah, it usually starts with a eureka. In this case, it was, how about we use ultrasound? Because it can detect the disfiguration of the muscle. And then we go to the planning mode. Okay, so how much data we need to collect, and what arm and what fingers can he move? And then comes what you just described, which is a training. So after we come up with a network, what would be the best neural network to be trained for this purpose? When we have 5 fingers and we want to move, maybe we want to move discretely, but maybe we also want to know how much to move, so it can be forte or piano. So a lot of thinking about what kind of algorithm to use. And then there's period of hours and days in which he has to come to the lab and say this finger and move it multiple times, that finger, and so on. And then there's a big eureka when we try to train the network, see that it works, put the sensor on him, and put him next to a piano. And oftentimes, getting nothing, but when you get something, it's very exciting.
Yeah, definitely. Were there any moments where you thought, shit, is this really going to work? Like, are we in a completely wrong direction here?
Yeah, oftentimes. Actually, we tried to commercialize it, and we couldn't so far. So that is, I'm currently in a way in one of these moments. I don't know how it can be commercialized, because you need to have the sensor really, really accurate, and it cannot move, because if it moves, you lose the data. And we found out that if we try to generalize it and to train the network and let other musicians try to play it, their muscle work differently, and people get the amputation in different locations. So maybe come back in a few years when we're successful, and I can tell you about today when I thought it will never work. Or maybe it will really never work.
But so when you find yourself in a situation like this now, what's your approach of getting out of it and find a solution? Do you have some like a systematic approach to that?
I don't think I have a systematic approach. It's oftentimes just dealing with a problem and digging deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And sometimes you find something you didn't think about, that by continuing to thinking and reading papers and finding, sometimes this works. But oftentimes, just telling yourself, let's think about it from a completely different point of view, is what solves it. I can tell you the story about actually the arm. So we started with the EMG sensing electromyography from the muscle, and we just could get squeezing and opening the muscle. And we looked at many different kind of ways to improve that, to be able to do finger by finger. And at some point, I read and I found that there's this technology that you put little needles, like acupuncture needles, very, very not deep. You can put it deeper into the body, and you get better, cleaner results, and you may be able to know more about what finger is being used. So we went to one of my colleagues' labs here, and we said, okay, let's try this needle-based, this invasive EMG electromyography to sense the muscle. And when we get to the lab, we said, okay, so where should we put it? Where should we put the needle? We need to know how many needles to put and how deep to put them, and hopefully this will give us more information. And just to know where to put them, this colleague of mine said, here I have an ultrasound machine. Let's put the ultrasound on his arm so we see what muscle moves, and then we know where to put the EMG needles. And that was a eureka moment, because we put the ultrasound and suddenly we saw that the data that we have just from ultrasound can be so great. Why do we need to put even EMG? And there was a eureka moment. Forget about this EMG. Let's try to find small ultrasound sensors, and without any invasive anything, we can possibly get the data, and we can train this network. And that was a great eureka moment, because that led to the Skywalker project.
Cool. But so when we talk about data in this sort of way, where you get a reading, from the arm and the brain, how does that become like data, and what sort of data does it become, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's when you get electrical activity from the muscle, it's basically getting spikes of electricity, and you just put them in a format that we can read. How many spikes? It's like sequence of spikes over time from different locations. So it's all just like data management. You have multiple electrodes. Each electrode looks like an audio signal in a way. You have a spike, and then you have some noise, and a spike, and a noise. And we take all of this and we try to find the patterns in it. Ultrasound is similar. It's pixels moving on the screen. And for us, it's too many pixels to find patterns, but machine learning is designed exactly for that. So that's exactly what we did. We just, when you feed a network for visuals, when you have a network that has to detect faces, you just feeds all these pixels, and the patterns makes themselves apparent as the network is being trained.
So when you find yourself like thinking about a problem, struggling, you're thinking too deep on something, how do you get out of that wrong route, so to speak? Like, how do you shift your thinking to come from a different direction rather than keep hammering away on something that doesn't work?
The answer might be recursive, because for me, oftentimes, the answer is music. Just leave your whatever musical technology problem that you're dealing with, that you're stuck in, go and do something completely else. And in my case, it's oftentimes listening to music, or walking in nature, or going to the gym, and come back with a completely fresh mind. It doesn't work always, but for me, sticking and digging too deep for too long usually leaves you not only at the same dead end, but even more frustrated. So I think the trick is to know when to leave everything and take a break. Sometimes an hour break will help. Sometimes, I don't know, a week, if you can afford it, and come back to the problem.
Makes sense, man. Well, Gil, it's been a real pleasure. I really appreciate taking your time. I know you're busy. But yes, super fascinating what you guys do, and I look forward to seeing some more stuff coming. I'm gonna check out the music and all that. So yeah, thank you, Gil. It was a real pleasure.